It's funny talking about learning from people that maybe don't have as much business experience as you or haven't spent as much time in a career. In some ways, I kind of think about that as interacting with my children, like a 2-year-old. So a 2-year-old's discovery of the world is incredible. It's creative, seeing patterns that I would never see and seeing things that it's like, wow, how did you piece those things together? And so when you get to work with younger folks in the workforce, that don't haven't had the clouded view of years and years and years of
Mm.
experience and training and perspective from other people pouring into them. There's this creativity that exists of like, hey, have you thought about doing it this way or that way? Or there's almost a beautiful naivety to it that can really be applied well for those folks that have been in careers for longer periods of time.
Yeah, and I think we need to cultivate that. And
Yeah.
and that goes back to culture, right? When you're in a startup, there every single person is impacting and influencing the culture. And you need to, from the top, create an environment that embraces that and does not stifle that. Because that happens everywhere, right? Everyone comes in with a different thought process. And if you have an environment that is not welcoming or doesn't invite new ideas, you're going to miss out on just different ways of doing things.
All right. Stacey Feldman, how we doing?
We're doing great.
Yeah?
Yeah. The gloomy Seattle day. Nothing out of the ordinary today, but feeling good. Yeah.
A day in the life of somebody who lives in Seattle is nothing that I'm quite familiar with, because I hear it does rain a lot.
It's not as much rain. It's like just this constant cloud and then like a drizzle. So you can go outside
Mm,
in it, but you don't really want to.
yeah.
And then there's usually about an hour in the middle of the day where there's sun. And if you don't go out, you miss it. And then you feel bad for your dog if you don't get them on the walk.
Yeah, I hear you there. I'll stick with the 300 plus days of sunshine in beautiful Colorado. Um,
Which I'm very excited to get back to in about a week.
yeah, yeah, you're coming back to the
Hmm.
Sunshine State. Is that a thing? It is
That's
now.
Florida.
That's Florida. Close enough. Well, I'm excited to have you back. It's gonna be a lot of fun. And actually, today, you served as inspiration for today's topic from a
Call me an
LinkedIn post.
influencer.
Yes, yes, the LinkedIn influencer that is Stacey is influencing this topic today in terms of what is it like to work for a startup relative to a big company? What are the benefits that lie therein? And so you had three key highlights in terms of benefits of working for a startup. One, doing work that matters. Two, gaining a macro understanding of business. And three, creating a company culture. And so I'd love
Yeah.
to hear a little bit of your perspective on their history as to kind of how you came to this conclusion, this thought, and would love for you to kind of give us some background.
Oh, well, I should highlight with the fact that LinkedIn post that I posted earlier this week. I screenshotted a post I made 9 years ago, which was an article titled Seven Reasons to Ditch the Corporate World for a Career in a Startup. And 9 years ago, for me in my career, I had just declined competing offers at Big Four. I was planning to go into tax at EY in Denver, and I had worked my whole college career to get that offer, right? That was a really proud moment and excited for that. But I then met by happenstance the founder of PopSockets, worked there for 6 years as the first employee, grew that company fairly large. So this post was me probably a year into that endeavor and reflecting on what I was learning in the startup space and just being exposed to as compared. I didn't really have a strong baseline, right? My comparison was an internship with PwC in Boston. So not like I do want to caveat my thoughts here with the fact that I don't have the full big company perspective. I can garner a lot of points from folks I know, but yes, the three things I think for me the most beneficial, and there's plenty to kind of think about for my own biases, but doing work that matters is the first. Gaining a macro understanding, just understanding business overall and not a siloed perspective, and then just having a say and a influence on company culture.
Now,
But Yeah,
You
go ahead.
didn't have that perspective though before joining PopSockets, right? Because the traditional career path for an accountant in school is to get your 150, you get recruited by Big Four and a bunch of other large public firms, and that's where 90+% of students tend to gravitate towards because that's the only option. It's not the
Hmm.
only option, but that's what the perception is at that point in time. And so you take a massive risk by saying, all right, I'm going to forego this opportunity to work at a startup.
Yeah, interesting. And looking back on this, I don't know where I was ever exposed to startups or like had this interest because I remember I had a year off before my offer started. That was to get my CPA. So I had a delay for a year and I needed a job just to pay rent and, have money. And in that year, I remember saying, I want to get involved in startups. I want to find founders. I don't know how I knew that though.
Hmm.
I don't know where that came from. I'm grateful for whatever pushed me in that direction. But that's how then in that year I met the PopSockets founder when he was still, hiring his landscapers to help him put some orders together. And it was a very tough decision at the time. I had worked really hard for this big four role. It's secure. I have a 401k. I have a clear path and direction, right? Everything was kind of laid out for me. And with PopSockets, I mean, we didn't have payroll. I was 1099, it didn't have anything. I went in and started all of that. But it got to a point where I was working there just helping with everything and you get this like belief in it in the company and you can see the traction. You're walking more and more orders down to the post office every day. You see some real growth there. And you're seeing what people are how they're reacting to the product. So that gave me some confidence of making that leap. Also, my dad said, he's like, you can always go back to public. You can
Yeah.
always, if this doesn't work out, you're young, try it. You can fail and it'll be fine. So that
But
was
when,
kind of the big thing.
yeah, but when you joined, it's not like you joined as a pure accountant. You weren't doing accounting day in, day out. You were wearing a lot of hats.
My first day, we had just gotten a shipment from Asia for 10,000 units, and they were all poorly manufactured. So they were like wonky and uneven. And I had to go through open packaging, fix it, take, basically doing QC. Which ones can we sell? Which ones we have to throw away? Stapling the packaging shut. That was my day one work. Um, but, it was also, hey, you're smart. You can help figure out orders to the factory. Let's use these spreadsheets. Let's get this data in. Let's find a system. Let's collect money. Let's reconcile that money. And I always went with the lens of I want to kind of continue with this accounting path and
Hmm.
be I always like wanted to be where I would have been at the big
Yeah.
four. It was like my own goal, which I think if I had a different perspective, I probably would have gone further with the company, but that's okay. So yeah, I was always on the accounting side, the finance, getting payroll, HR, and building this. Like I took the first ever customer service call. We're like, oh, a customer's calling us. I found a phone number for the company. Very, very early stage things. And just give perspective too. By the time I left, we were about just under 300 million in revenue and about 200 employees across 5
Jeez.
global entities. So we did grow the company quite large and many points through that path. I was eternally grateful for making that decision and that it worked out because I did know that that's not always the case. And
Yeah.
I continue to learn that as I'm more and more working with startups. So there's a lot of luck in this overall process, and that's not always the experience that folks have when they take an opportunity or a role at a startup.
Yeah, and what's interesting to me is that I've heard a lot of advisors and people who, support employees at early stage companies basically say, "Hey, these options that you're getting at this startup, you just have to assume that have no value and
Mm-hmm.
that they will never accrue to a point where you're going to get rich quick, you're going to have this massive windfall of cash." And they say just do not plan
Mm-hmm.
on any cash coming out of that because that's generally the typical outcome.
Yes. And, I've had to learn that in subsequent startups that I've worked with. And, one has had to close its doors. And, yeah, you take a pay cut because you have equity, yet the equity could be absolutely meaningless. So there are plenty of risk factors. Typically, when I talk to folks who are interested in working or joining in a startup, I always start with the conversation of risk reward and what are their personal circumstances. Everyone has a different financial place that they're in. So we talk about that for a little bit. And if, people need money, need income, I always recommend go for a Series B or further financed company, right?
Yeah.
An audit in place, you have a full team, you have investors who believe in the company, you're financed. It doesn't promise that the company will continue and sustain because we've all seen plenty of layoffs and downsizing, and especially in today's economy. But being at that B plus, probably even C plus round financing, it gives a little bit more assurance in the balance, right? You can usually have a better salary offer coming in, probably some mix of equity, but it's less risky for sure. But to my point in my article, you're still experiencing a lot of the benefits of working in a startup space.
Well, and I feel like maybe you can dive a little bit deeper onto how working with startups change your perspective to appreciate things like building a culture, getting a macro understanding of business, doing work that matters. Because as a graduate, as somebody early in their career, it's hard to have that perspective of like, hey, this is valuable. Even if the commensurate compensation isn't there, you can make up for that by having learnings or impact on these other areas in your career. So like, how did you come to that realization of, hey, this is important to me and I want to lean into these areas?
Yeah, I'd say for doing work that matters, that's mostly like you're happy in what you're working on.
Yeah.
And the reason typically, I will also caveat that not everyone is suited well for startup work. There are
Right.
plenty of people who do incredibly well with their style of learning and output at big companies. My husband included, he's really works really well at big companies. But for doing work that matters, what I want to emphasize there is oftentimes things are incredibly fast paced. There's no time to make the most well-informed decision. You use what you have available to you at that point in time. But usually it's a group decision, and you have a say in that decision of what work is getting done, what work is most meaningful to work on today to reach a certain outcome. You often also see the results of that outcome. Now, if we're talking accounting specifically, if you just have a bank rec, right? If you don't do the bank rec in a startup, you don't know how much cash you have on your financial statements, right? So I think from a startup side of things, when you make small changes in the business, the weight of those changes are greater. You're doing them because they're the most important. So if you're doing them because they're the most important, you're usually going to see a result or impact of that decision. So it makes you happy. You get it's like Pavlov's dog. You get excited for the reward, and it happens all the time. Now the flip side of that is that there's challenges too, but it's incredibly rewarding, and it builds a lot of trust in team members when you can do work that matters together and see the result of that work together.
Yeah, and it's something that early in my career I wouldn't have had that perspective necessarily. I intentionally went to go work at a mid-market firm so I could work with smaller businesses and see that. But I don't know that I would have innately taken the risk to go work for a small company because I just didn't have the perspective of all these additional benefits that can come via working with a really early stage company. And I just didn't have the frame of mind to say the value, the education element of working with a small company and seeing that direct output of what your inputs are in the business, just didn't have that connectivity early in my career.
Yeah, and how would you, right? When we come out of school, we don't really know much of anything. But I'm very interested in seeing how the next generation, how they navigate the workspace, because
Mm-hmm.
I have a feeling, I have no data behind this, but I have a feeling that a lot of the way that the next generation has grown up is instant gratification, like seeing things more quickly. And that is a lot of the time what it's like in a startup. Comes with a lot of work as well. But I think about working in a large company. There's let's say I don't know, what can you think of a big corporation?
Walmart.
Walmart. Working in as a GL accountant in Walmart. I don't know what their market cap is, but it's quite large. So if you're a GL accountant in Walmart, you're probably reconciling a tiny subset of their prepaid expenses. Your whole job is prepaid expenses,
Yeah.
and you're figuring out how to record them, what's important, just very, very small focus of prepaids. Probably doing a fantastic job, very valuable work. But that brings me to my second point of when you're in a startup, you're exposed to the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
You have a much broader and macro view of business and how things are intertwined, how relationships among the different departments work. And for me, I loved that, right? I love zooming out. So focusing on a very small thing for me would be challenging because I like to see the bigger picture and how everything is integrated.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people are suited for that. And obviously, like we're gonna shill for working for small businesses all day because we like that grind, we like that energy, we like that direct connectivity. Yet there are many paths in large companies that you can have similar exposure um, by asking for it, by putting yourself in
Mm-hmm.
positions to grow into those roles that allow for opportunity for growth and advancement, but then also have the capability to be trained and educated really well within the context of a large company. So don't want to sit here and say like, oh, small business is the only way to go, because there's a lot of people that are really well suited to work for big companies.
Absolutely. Yeah, I want to mirror that too, right? Like I said, my husband has worked at large corporations. I'm the stock, he's the bond in the relationship. We balance each other really well. And he loves that he knows exactly what he needs to do to get to the next
Yeah,
level. He's talked to the person at the next level, knows what their job is like, right? He loves that environment and it works really well for him. Me, I like ambiguity. I like changing things up. I like making my own path. So it really comes down to a lot of what preferences you have.
yeah,
And the challenge too, which I just feel for young folks, right? You don't know what you prefer. You don't know unless you do it.
yeah,
And you find it and you're in there and you're like, I either hate this or I'm loving it.
yeah.
So it's really trial by error in a lot of cases.
Yeah, it is. And that's just the beauty of a career, right? Like you can plan out 10 years into the future, but it's going to change after that first year. And that's
Hmm.
okay. I would certainly recommend like giving something a year at least to get comfortable, to understand the environment, and then make a maybe more well-informed decision after the fact.
Yeah.
But in
I,
talking about working for small businesses or large organizations, we support startups and early stage companies, and companies that are going through either large scales of growth or bringing on capital to expand and hire. We're a small company ourselves, and so from your perspective, when you're evaluating bringing somebody on to a small team, what are some of those characteristics that you tend to look for?
I believe that in a small team, every single person that is hired makes a critical change and impact to the dynamic of the culture. So it's very important at the early stages that you're adding the right type of folks who have the same vision and view of prioritization and goal setting to continue with the feel of the company and what is already prioritized. Um, a lot of what I look for, especially now for us in Full Send, is willingness to learn. I think that there's no matter who you are, you must be a lifelong learner. We all have something to learn from
Yeah,
everyone we meet. And the thing I don't want is stifling someone who stifles the learning process, the growing process. It's very important to be vulnerable and say, I don't know anything about this. Help me learn. Let's go out and find the answer together.
yeah,
That's a very soft skill, right? That's not,
yeah,
you learn people's thought process through conversation. Um, sure, we want some core skill sets in certain roles, but it's talking with folks, feeling really comfortable with one another, and figuring out what drives them to be successful.
I feel like that in and of itself is a really good point, the lifelong learner thing, because you hear that all the time. Oh, I'm a lifelong learner, and I want to continue doing that. And I think an important element of that is that I didn't have this again perspective when I was in my early mid 20s of you learn and learn and learn, and you grow in your career, and you understand more about the business realm, and you feel like you've got things figured out. But I feel like the the perspective to have on that is like the more you learn, the more you understand that there's so much more out there
Yeah.
that you're unaware of. And so like
Hmm.
that exponential capacity to learn things outside of your given domain is immense. And so just knowing that, our realm of information is so small relative to others and their capabilities and perspectives and backgrounds is, I think it's really important to have that perspective.
Oof, I just had a very humbling moment last night. As I mentioned, we're moving. So my husband's meeting with all his folks here that he knows and enjoys spending time with. And we're having dinners and just saying our goodbyes. And he works in such a different area than what you and I do every day. Engineer, just there. We talked, we had dinner for 2 hours. I followed like 10% of the conversation. And it was humbling, right? I'm like, geez, there's everyone we know can narrow and focus in a certain area based on their experiences and based on what they've done. And we may know nothing about that. And there's just such an opportunity for us to learn from one another.
Yeah.
And, especially from folks we hire. I love learning from people who may have fewer years experience than me. There's always something to learn from every person we meet.
It's funny talking about learning from people that maybe don't have as much business experience as you or haven't spent as much time in a career. In some ways, I kind of think about that as interacting with my children, like a 2-year-old. So a 2-year-old's discovery of the world is incredible. It's creative, seeing patterns that I would never see and seeing things that it's like, wow, how did you piece those things together? And so when you get to work with younger folks in the workforce, that haven't had the clouded view of years and years and years of
Mm.
experience and training and perspective from other people pouring into them. There's this creativity that exists of like, hey, have you thought about doing it this way or that way? Or there's almost a beautiful naivety to it that can really be applied well for those folks that have been in careers for longer periods of time.
Yeah, and I think we need to cultivate that. And
Yeah.
and that goes back to culture, right? When you're in a startup, there every single person is impacting and influencing the culture. And you need to, from the top, create an environment that embraces that and does not stifle that. Because that happens everywhere, right? Everyone comes in with a different thought process. And if you have an environment that is not welcoming or doesn't invite new ideas, you're going to miss out on just different ways of doing things.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point of for anybody looking to work at a smaller business, trying to get inside of the mindset of the people that you'd be working for or working alongside is so important because a lot of companies can put their values up on a wall and they can be just that, values on a wall. But
Mm-hmm.
we've talked a lot about allowing everybody at the company to have a seat at the table, and the feedback is heard from if you're talking levels from the CEO down to the analyst lowest level position. And I don't think that we have a perspective in that there's greater value at one position or another because we want to hear feedback from everybody. And it's critical to have that.
Yeah. Our good friend Adam Grant, in his, I can't remember the name of the company that owns Gore-Tex. Um, I can't remember, but in his speech in Vegas, he talked about how the company that owns Gore-Tex, they have a leadership structure or just a framework where if you have an idea, you can go to anyone in a senior position above you, pitch it to them, and you just need one person to believe in it or say yes, and
Yeah.
then it make its way up the chain. Because what they identified is, every employee, if it goes through the standard chain of command, it's just your one manager and
Yeah.
their view and their exposure and their experience that can then stifle all ideas and creativity. So if you have more folks that have the ability to raise ideas up the chain, you're going to have cultivate more ideas and more growth. And I think you don't need a totally flat leadership structure to still have an environment that promotes strong culture, great idea generation, and just overall a growth mindset.
Yeah, and that's where, ideally in a smaller company, a smaller environment, you're capable of bubbling those things up. That may not be the case depending on the leadership of that company, but I would say that the odds of success are much higher to have your ideas, your different initiatives be heard and implemented, and also implemented much more quickly. Because a lot of the big companies,
Yeah.
there are layers and layers and layers of approval and red tape and politics that you need to get through in order to actually observe that change happening.
Yeah. Less bureaucracy for good or for bad, less process, for good or for bad. But I agree. And that's, I think, back to the pace of things. It's much quicker, much faster. You need to adapt, you need to change. You might be working on a project for 6 months that becomes obsolete, and all that time spent, and it's just kind of one of the pros and cons of working in that type of environment.
Yeah. And so we have a lot of clients who have raised capital and they're looking to hire, they're looking to bring folks on board. Are there any specific questions you would recommend asking to a founder or somebody if you're going into an interview or a discussion in evaluating a small business to work with?
I mean, if you can get a conversation with the founder, that's one of the best folks to talk through ideas with. But I always, this isn't always available, but I always like to see financials. You can have some startups who preach a certain metric or contribution margin or what have you, but things might not look as well under the hood as are spoken.
Sure.
I think that's an important thing. Or ask prodding questions around what's your growth figures, what's your cash balance, what's your burn rate. All certain things that you can kind of get a sense of what the situation is at the company. I'd talk about values. I'd love talking about how the leadership team promotes values and direction within the company. How are you setting goals? How are you measuring those goals? How do you look at success in your own team members? If you think about your most successful employee, what characters do they have that you really value in the workplace? A lot of them are soft skills, and it depends on the founder versus different roles. But if you're working with someone day in and day out at a startup, you're typically interfacing with folks very closely, and you want to make sure you enjoy that person's company as well. You can have tough conversations. You feel comfortable talking about things that are challenging, and if they're open to that.
I like the values question a lot because I feel like there are times where values or mission get set at one point and then so easily forgotten, like the example of them just being on a wall. And if you talk to somebody and they can't say, here's our value number 1, number 2, and number 3, and articulate that really well, probably a red flag.
You're saying that, and I'm thinking about, we got to touch base with our clients and talk about that, in the next round, and as we do 2024 reviews, just see how they're thinking about that.
Yeah. And what's funny is like that falls so far outside the realm of accounting, but yet these are the things that we want to help instill in our clients of, hey, if you're going to grow, here are things that you really need to be thinking about. If you want to attract high level employees, it's far less important that they have X Google on their resume, and far more important that they align to help your company grow. That they have that ability to lean into different areas of the business. They're curious. They're asking the right questions. Those all fall so far outside of accounting yet are so important.
Yeah, I think there needs to be also a healthy balance and assessment of the number of doers and the number of reviewers. In a startup in particular, where there's got to be a good number of doers, right? And each person, I think, needs to have a healthy combination of doer versus reviewer. But it can become too top heavy at some companies, where there's too many people who have seen it before, can understand the vision, but don't actually know how to actually execute on it. And then the other way around, if you have too many doers but no guidance or leadership, you're doing things but maybe not in the direction that has been set and a path forward to a certain goal. So I think from a founder perspective, you need to have a pulse on that.
That is probably one of the most difficult things to interview for, because anybody in an interview can say, "Yeah, I'll roll up my sleeves, I'll dig in." And so an example of that could be if you're looking as a startup to make your first sales hire, you need a sales leader, you need somebody to architect the process. Maybe you look for that CRO or that high level, sales operator from a large company, bring them in. But then if they're not willing to be the BDR, the AE, and the CRO and fill all of those roles, there's not going to be a lot of success there. And so
Mm-hmm.
it is so hard to ask the right probing questions to get to the point where you know that the person's capable of leaning in and doing to get the job done.
It's tricky. It's really tricky. And one of the more challenging things to do is to fail fast. When you recognize you have the wrong hire, maybe you needed a leader and you hired a doer, or whatever that may be, identifying that quickly and making changes fast, which
Yeah.
I go back and forth on, because I'm a very big advocate on training and support. But in hyper growth startups, there's also a time and place to make hard decisions.
Yeah, that's a really hard one from a hiring perspective as a small company, because you hired somebody clearly because you see potential in them. But if they're not filling that specific role that you hire them for, you either are going to have to spend a lot more time in training them to get to that place or fail fast. And
Mm-hmm.
boy, that is probably one of the most grueling decisions that a lot of founders have to go through.
It is. And it's one of the biggest differences between working in a startup and working in a large company, where large companies often have the time, resources to train, to build, to grow
Yeah.
a skill set to get to the next level. Whereas in a startup, you need someone to do that because you don't have time to do it yourself. And you also don't have time to train them on that skill set. So it's one of the necessary evils of the startup environment.
Yeah, so for anybody that's looking to land a position at a small company, I think a few steps to take: do your due diligence, get online, go through the website, look at the core values, look at the people that are involved, look at their backgrounds, see how maybe their expertise and their journey to that point in time correlates to the types of things that you're looking for, you're looking to learn, and start to deduce what types of questions would be really helpful in terms of getting into a conversation with the company, the leader, the team.
Go onto LinkedIn, see what they're posting. Are you inspired by that? Does it make you excited? How are they going to interact day in and day out? There's ways to see those type of things that are difficult to ask in questions.
That, and the other thing I'll say is, if you are inspired, if you do see something that's really cool, if you're like, man, that's interesting, I'd love to learn more, reach out. Just send a note. What's the
Mm-hmm.
worst thing that could possibly happen? You get a non-response or a no. And if that's the worst thing that happened, you're going to be just fine. And so I would say take that one step outside of your comfort zone to send that message.
Yeah, one of the best ways to identify whether you're going to do better in a big company or in a startup is to talk to people. Get out there, learn about people's experiences, learn about things they love, things they don't like, see how that resonates with you, and help guide to that next decision.
Well, I am very excited to continue growing our team and identifying those individuals that want to participate in a small company, want to help other small businesses and startups grow. It's a very dynamic space. It's not made for everybody, but there are a core group of accountants and folks in our circles that really get excited by that. So I am very excited to march down that path.
Likewise. Can't wait.
Well, that's our chat on working at small and big companies and what questions to ask, how to get there, and what it's like. Thank you for joining us today. You can find us on LinkedIn at Stacey Feldman, CPA, or Roman Villard, CPA, and our website's at fullsendfinance.com. And don't hesitate to reach out. Send us a note. We'll talk to you next time.
We're here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Building in the Wild. If you found value in our conversation, we'd appreciate a review on Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcasts. To stay up to date, make sure to hit that subscribe button. For more insights and additional information, our YouTube is at Full Send Finance, and our website is fullsendfinance.com. Remember, the business landscape may be wild, but you don't have to navigate it alone. Build together, go further. Until next time.